My presentation today is called Proactive Leader or Compliance Administrator, Which Are You? And what I'm trying to look at is the similarities between the business objectives, the objectives of your customers and the objectives of your staff, and how they all meld into the same thing and they all want the same thing. But before I go into the main body of the presentation, I'd like to take a couple of minutes really on reflection because over the last 5 or 6 years we've been through one hell of a recession, and a lot of people have lost their jobs, there's been a lot of unemployment, and it's been really, really tough for a lot of people. And I think that everybody in this room really ought to congratulate themselves, because we're still in the game, we're still in the ring, we've come through it. So we must have done something right to survive in it. And I think that's a great accolade. And what I see going forward over the next 4 or 5 years is that there are some fantastic opportunities out there for businesses that are well organised, well run and focused. And they're the ones that are going to win. And I think there are some good opportunities. I mean, sooner or later there will be another downturn. But I think that the businesses that are well organised, well run, will be able to see that coming and survive and come out of that stronger too. So I think we all ought to really be proud of ourselves that we're still here. Now, in the time I've been in business and running businesses and owning them and being involved with them, I've always come across businesses that seem to grow, and they grow over the first 2 or 3 years and then they seem to stagnate. Whereas other businesses seem to start going and just keep going and going. And I've always thought, well, why is that? What is the difference between those businesses? And I've come to a conclusion, a thing that I call clutter. And what I mean by that is, when we all start off in our businesses, we're very passionate and we've got a focus. We want to tell people how good our service is, how good our product is, where we see the business going, how it fits in. And we start off and our businesses start to really grow. And then I see a fair few, that energy gets dissipated and they slow down and they hit this glass ceiling. And I say that's because these people get clutter in lives. And what I mean by the clutter is they'll get involved in HR, they'll get involved in administration, they'll get involved in accounts, which isn't their key skill. And their energy dissipates, whereas the ones that start and carry on growing are the ones who delegate that away. And they build a team around them of people who can deliver those services. So they focus on their goal. And I think that's one thing that we all ought to bear in mind, is I don't know, I've never been involved in a business or set a business up where I've been really keen to become an administrator. So bear that in mind, that try not to get our clutter in our lives. And then one of the other questions I like to ask to people, and people always ought to focus on, is what is the purpose of your business? What is it there for? What's it there to achieve? Why did we set it up? And more importantly, can we succinctly communicate to people what that purpose is, the elevator test? Can we, in a minute or 2 minutes, explain to somebody what our business is about? Because I would suggest 2 things. If we can't explain what our business is about succinctly in a couple of minutes, I don't think we understand what our business is. And secondly, if we're trying to communicate it to somebody and we're rambling on for 5 to 10 minutes, 2 things are going to happen at that. One, the poor guy on the receiving end is going to lose the will to live. And secondly, he's going to be thinking, well, you don't really understand your business, so why would I trust my trade with your business? So we have to really make sure that we understand what the purpose of our business is. And that takes me back a few years when I first established Houghton Stone. There was a local bank manager, a guy called Mike Page. Some of you might remember him or not from Lloyds Bank Commercial Banking. And he was seen as a bit of a rainmaker, a bit of a mover and a shaker. And all the accountants and lawyers would take him out to lunch and face him, trying to get work out of him. And I followed the same path, and I took him out to lunch, had a nice lunch with him. But at the end of that lunch, he said to me, you know, Dickie, you're one of the first accountants I've actually been out to lunch with who's told me what you want. He said, I go out with lots of accountants all the time and I sit down, have a nice lunch, talk about the wife, the kids, the football, all those good things. And I come away thinking, well, what did they want from that meeting? What was the purpose of that meeting? And he said, you've sat here and you've told me exactly the type of customer Houghton wants, the ones it doesn't want. Exactly the type of work Houghton wants to do and the type of work it doesn't want to do. And where you see it fitting into the Bristol business market and where you're going with it. He said, that's fantastic. He said, I really understand what your business is, what it does, and where it wants to go. He said, but the bad news is, I can't give you any of that sort of work. And I thought, bugger, and I've got to pay for the lunch. But what he did say is, he said, because I understand that, he said, in my team, there's 2 or 3 people who've got the sort of work that you want. And he said, and I suggest you go and talk to them. And because I understand it and I get it, I'm going to endorse you to them. So you go and see them because they've got the work you want, and I'm assuming you've got the work they want, so it'd be mutually beneficial. He said, in the meantime, I like going out to lunch, I like being entertained, I'll still see these other accountants and lawyers. I can't give them any work, but that will give you a free run-up at them. So the first thing I think is always remember, what is the purpose of your business? And then the second thought I try to give to people is that we should all strive to be the businesses that our customers and our staff expect us to be. And when I look at it, they both want the same thing. So if you look at it from a customer's point of view, what do they want? They want to know that we know our market, that we understand our product, so that we're not selling them something they don't want. They also want to know that we're well run and we're well organised. Can we deal with their queries? Can we supply them on time? Are we going to look after them? And in a fair few years ago, in the early days of Houghton, I took on a customer called Rob, and he'd been in business 15 years before we set up. And a couple of years ago, I was having a beer with him, he's still a client of ours, and he said to me, he said, you know, Dickie, about 6 or 7 years ago, I knew that something was up at Houghton and there was some change in the air and something was going on. I said, oh, how did you know that? And he said, well, when I first came to Houghton, I could see a business there that was well directed, well run, well organised and was confident. And it knew where it was going. And I said, well, how did you know that? He said, well, I'd have a meeting with you, we'd discuss it, we'd have an outcome of the meeting, and you'd tell me what you were going to bill me. He said, and then the next day or the day afterwards, I'd get the invoice. And then a couple of weeks later, you'd start chasing for payment. So he said, so that gave me confidence that your business was well run. It was well organised, it was confident, and it chased things up. And he said, and about 5 or 6 years ago, he said, I can remember I had a meeting with you, you told me what you were going to bill me, and I didn't get the bill for about a week. And that made me start thinking, I wonder what's up there. And he said, then you certainly didn't start to chase it for about 6 weeks. And that made me think, has the business lost its drive, its focus, where it's going? He said, but you know, luckily he could then see when we refocused it, we got it back on track. But we have to remember, our customers look at us and how do we run our businesses? Now, if we look at it, our staff want exactly the same thing. They want to know, where's the business going? Where does it see itself fitting in? What's their role in it? How do they fit in with it? What's expected of them? How are we going to measure them? How are we going to benchmark them to ensure that they are achieving the goal? And about a year ago, we had a position in our business services department. And our business services department goes in and works with boards of directors to work out What are their information requirements? What do they need, the knowledge to run their businesses? And when do they need it by? And what information do they use for their decisions? So it's quite a tricky job. And then we look at the information system they have. Is it adequate? Can we make it fit for purpose? Do we need to put a new information system in? And because atypically Sage has got 65% of the small business market, we also needed somebody who understood Sage, but not just how to input and output from the Sage, but how to produce these reports, format them, and get them out in a timely manner. So John and Ilona, who head up that division, were tasked with going on the recruitment trail. And they alighted on a girl called Rebecca, and they wanted to give her the job. Now, before anybody gets offered a job at Houghton Stone, I like to meet with them and have a cup of tea with them, a 10-minute chat. And the main reason for that is to make sure that they understand Houghton Stone, they understand the DNA of Houghton Stone, where we see the journey going and where we want the business to be, and that they've bought into it. So, during that discussion with her, I said to her, which I suppose you would, why do you want to work at Houghton Stone? And she said to me, she said, because you're organised. I said, okay, then can you expand on that? What do you mean by organised? I said, well, she said, when I realised I got the interview, I went onto the website and had a look at the website, and that was all really good and looked very entrepreneurial and that. She said, but obviously sometimes what's on the website and what's actually going on at the ranch isn't one and the same thing. She said, and I knew I had to come for an interview with John and Ilona, and I knew that part of that interview process would be I'd have to take two tests, one accountancy test and one on Sage. She said, so I came for the interview with John and Ilona, and they really drilled down into me on, you know, what had I done, what would I want to be doing, how did I see my career progressing, what skill set I'd got, and then I did the test. So she said, I came away from that interview thinking they really know the type of person that they want and how they will fit in. So she said, I then came back for the second interview where I was told what the first 3 months would look like, what the next 6 months would look like, and a heads up on what the year would look like. And more importantly, the type of work I'd be doing, how I'd be appraised, when I would be appraised, and a sort of a career progression, and how, if it all goes well, I would fit into the business services unit and where that business wants to go. So she said that gave me great confidence. They knew the type of person they wanted and how they would fit in, and also the role and where the business was going. So she said, so that's why I want to come to Houghton Stone. So needless to say, I gave her the job. But that got me to thinking, where she had just left had spent an inordinate amount of time, money, effort and resource to get her to be the go-to Sage person in that organisation. And not only was she the go-to person for their staff and the partners, but also their customers. And that resource had just walked out the door. And the reason that she left there was because she said they weren't organised. The left and the right hand didn't know what they were doing. So when the work came in, it was, well, who's going to do it? Well, whoever was available. And they certainly had no idea of where the partners wanted to take that business and where it was going. It all was a bit disorganised, which made her feel a bit insecure. So we always have to remember to try to strive to be the businesses that our customers and our staff expect us to be, because they are watching us. Now, all that is quite easy said, but how do we go about doing this? That's the big question. And I've got an outline of a few things that I think are really important, and what I'm hoping is from today you'll go away and it will stimulate some thought and some discussion around these topics. It's not an exhaustive list, but I think these are some very important things to bear in mind. And the first one is, I think, we really have to get under the skin of our staff. We really have to understand what makes them tick. And do they understand the journey we want our business to go on? And their role within it, and where they fit in, and their career progression, and how they see things. Because if they don't see it the same way as us, we're not going to get anywhere. So we have to really make sure that they're on track and get under the skin of our staff. Bill Gates puts down a huge amount of the success of Microsoft to the recruitment of his first 50 employees. And he says they spent an inordinate amount of time, money, resource and effort into getting that right, the first 50. Because as he said, they weren't looking all for the same personalities. You need different personalities within the organisation to make it work. But what he was looking for was that they understood the journey that Microsoft wanted to go on and the DNA of Microsoft, and that they had all bought into that core principle. So that as the business expanded, they were the gatekeepers of that. So they made sure that as more and more employees came on, that they indoctrinated these people with the DNA of Microsoft and make sure that they understood what was expected of them. So we really ought to understand our people and get under the skin of them. Coupled with that, we have to bear in mind that actions speak louder than words. And what I mean by that is we as the leaders and the owners of the businesses have to make sure that we walk the talk. That are we actually living up to the standards we expect our team to live up to? Because if we can't be bothered to do it, why should they? They're looking at us. If we can't be bothered, why should they? And there's a fantastic Japanese saying, the fish rots from the head. So we have to make sure that we actually walk the talk. Now, one of the other things I've seen in quite a lot of organisations that really undermines them is a blame culture. And we really have to eliminate a blame culture. There's nothing worse than being in a business where if a mistake is made, people start to point fingers. It was his fault, it was her fault. Because all that does is create a silo mentality. And that is a very unconfident business. The business that is confident is the one that realises that nobody turns up to work to make a mistake, but mistakes will happen. So you then assemble a little team, and within an hour, 10 minutes, you can resolve a problem and then move on. The organisations with the silo mentality always end up with problems. And one of the best examples I can think of that in the recent history is the Co-op Bank. I cannot believe that nobody in that organisation knew that there was a £1.5 billion hole in that balance sheet. I can't believe that. But when you hear from the way the CEO acted and that, you think, I should imagine there's a real silo mentality there and people were keeping their heads down thinking it'll go away. But I can't believe that nobody knew, unless they were all with the CEO in the toilet snorting coke and having a party. But if you contrast that to Sports Direct, look at the performance of that business and how that has gone. Yet they delegate a lot of their power down to the people on the shop floor. And it's interesting to note that one of their internal mantras is, made a mistake, move on. And what they're actually saying is, yes, we accept mistakes are going to be made, sort it out, try and put in place systems so it won't happen again, and then move on. So we have to really ensure that we try and eliminate a blame culture. Then, as
How do you marry up getting rid of a blame culture with always having a sense of accountability for your actions?
Because I think in a confident team, you will have a structure. I'll come on to that in a minute. You will have a structure within there where people know they've made a mistake. And as long as people are helping them to look at the mistake and work out why it was made, rather than blaming them for making the mistake, having the confidence say, I don't understand this, then you can rectify the situation and you can give them the extra training or whatever they need to make sure it doesn't happen again.
But you still have that sense of accountability.
Yes, because within each individual, you know, nobody wants to make a mistake. What we want is people to say, I think I don't understand this. So they are accountable, but they're accountable within the team. Yeah. And coupled with that, which is a point that comes back to that, is we as a managers and a management team should follow up relentlessly. And what I mean by that is that we don't want to have huge amounts of meetings, but we have to have meetings. And when people say they're going to do something by when, then we as managers have to follow up to make sure they have done what they said they'd do by when, and that they understand why that should be and where it fits in. Because if not, we haven't got a great management team. If they're always coming up with excuses as to why they haven't delivered something, there's two reasons for that. One is either they don't understand how to manage, and a lot of people get put into management positions, dive back to the job they were doing, so they've got the title, but they don't want the responsibility for it, or they're creating too much paperwork and there's too much weight on them to be able to deliver what they want. So we should always follow up relentlessly. And coupled with that is we should fight bureaucracy at every move. And what I mean by bureaucracy is we go into a lot of organisations and people are producing reports and there's a lot of paperwork and a lot of information. And you sit there and you think, well, who is using this information? What's the point of it? Where are they going with it and why? And a lot of the time you can sit down there and think, nobody's using this information that's being created. And I can always remember once doing a job in the NHS, and I went in to look at, it was something to do with the blood service, very important role. And they had a series of reports that produced, and it would take them 4 days a month to produce these reports. And I started looking at them, questioning, why are you producing these reports, and what do people do with the information from those reports? And it soon became apparent that 6 of the reports went up the line and were used. The rest of them ended up in a filing cabinet. So nobody actually looked at them, but they had them there because they'd always produced them. So when we went higher up through the organisation and worked it out, we cut the time spent on that job from 4 days to something like a day and a half a month. But the information they got was better quality because it wasn't clouded, and it allowed the manager to manage more. And I had a similar experience at the telecoms business I had. After a few years into that, we had a board of directors, and I was sat around the table and we had stacks of information. They were analysing everything. And I like to think I'm fairly numerate, and I was sat there thinking, I really don't understand what's going on in each of these divisions. I can't see the wood from the trees. We've got a lot of information, but there's no demarcation here. So I started to ask some of the directors, what are the 4 or 5 things that I need to know so I know you're running your division properly, you're doing your job properly? Tell me what they are. And a lot of them couldn't. So I sat down with them and said, well, if I were running your division, these are the 4 or 5 pieces of information I would require. The rest of it is background noise. Now, some of them got it and some of them didn't. And the ones that didn't, we had to call it a day. But the ones that did suddenly had ownership. They had responsibility for that number, and they knew where the number was coming from. So I could then sit with them and say, right, I know if you're doing a good job, because if those 2 numbers go up, those 2 go down and that stays level, you're doing what I'm paying you to do. And you could see that business suddenly really pick up pace because they had responsibility and everybody knew where the demarcation lines were. And that had a fantastic effect on that. So we've really got to make sure that we fight bureaucracy. within our organisations. Then coupled with that, once we've got that and we're looking at bringing in bonuses, rewards for achievement, we've got to really embrace generosity. We've got to really be pleased and really encourage people to hit their targets, to achieve the goals and the bonuses. Because there's nothing worse than working in an organisation whereby there are targets and bonuses, and if we hit that target or that bonus, the manager, oh, I suppose I better pay you a bonus, or they try and chip at it and they're not embracing it, because that really undermines the individual. And at the telecoms company we had, the chairman of that, he was also the chairman of one of the US's biggest printers. And I can always remember when it came towards the year end of the printing business, he would always be quite excitable. And one really sticks out in my mind. The one year, I said, oh, Sean, you're looking a bit agitated now. And he said, yeah, I'm off to America next week. I said, oh, why is that? He said, well, it's our year end just gone, and I'm intrigued to find out what the size of the bonus checks are that we're going to pay out this year. I said, well, why is that? He said, well, in particular, for a lady in Florida. He said, because last year, her bonus check was $2 million. I was flipping out, that's a bit of a bonus. And he said, I know. He said, fantastic. And he said, and I told her last year that I wanted this check to be $3 million this year. And I'm really keen to get out there and see how near she has got to that target. Because, it would be really fantastic. But what he got was, he wasn't looking at what she was getting out of it, which was a lot of money. He was looking at what he got out of it. And as long as he got out of it what he thought was fair, then he'd love to have paid her a 10 million bonus, because he was getting his end of the deal out of it. And the thing, I can always remember that, in stark contrast that, I can remember in a financial services business, a managing director of that business being really upset and letting it be known that he had got a salesman who for 2 years had earned a lot more than him. And he really didn't like this. And he let it be known. And what sticks in my mind is, he paid the bonus check to the guy begrudgingly. 2 months later, that guy resigned and left. And the reason he left was because he felt undervalued. And he didn't feel appreciated for the effort that he had put in. And at the end of the day, the company and he had agreed the deal that he was on, and he left. But the net result of that was that managing director had lost 20% of his business. So we really have to make sure that we embrace generosity. And one of the other things that I see is, going back to my original point, was at every chance we have to over-communicate our brand and its values. At every opportunity we should be there, remembering where we started from and telling people why they should buy from us, what our opportunities, where we're going with our business, over-communicate it. And it's interesting to note that some of the biggest readers of new car literature are people who've just bought that car, because they want to reassure themselves how clever they were in their purchasing decision, why they made it. So always remember, try and over-communicate the value of the brand. And one of the things that I've seen work really well in the past is with businesses to find a common enemy. And what I mean by that is, look for a competitor or somebody who you can benchmark yourselves against, and be saying to the team, we're going to be better than them. This is what they look like, but this is what we're going to look. We're going to beat them in all these things. A bit like the Jan Carlson SAS Airlines, when he turned that around. Don't be 1,000% better in one thing, be 1% better in 1,000 things. So pick a target and do it. And a great example of this was Avis car rentals in the 50s. In the 1950s, Hertz car rentals were by far the biggest in America. They had something like 75% of the market in car rental. Avis were number 2 with something like 8 to 12% of the market. And they were getting a panning. And they had stripped out their costs and that, and they had to really come up with how are they going to grow their market share. So Warren Avis and his team got together and had a huddle and that, and sat down with the marketing guys, and they came up with a strapline. When you're only number 2, you try harder. And obviously, that was a bit of a swipe at Hertz, saying, well, they're complacent, they're number 1, they've got slack, and because we're number 2, we are going to try harder. We're going to have the best cars, the best customer service, and all those good things. And they really pushed that, and it really galvanised the team. The result of it was over a 3 or 4 year period, they got to something like a 35% market share. Absolutely incredible. So finding a common enemy can really galvanise the troops. And the interesting thing from that was that when Hertz cottoned on to what Avis had done, they came back with the strapline, number 1 for a reason. So always bear that in mind, try and find a common enemy. Now, one of the final points I always like to bring out is we all ought to strive to find a better way to do things at every turn. Don't always run the same race. Because to me, the worst strategy we can have is to compete with our rivals in the same dimension. Because the only way we can do that is by operational efficiency, i.e. to run the race quicker. And if we think about that, if we think about sometimes what the big financial institutions have done, the banks have done, they're stripping out back office costs. They're trying to be operationally more efficient. Now, I know we have to look at our costs, but there's a tipping point where that can have an adverse effect. And we see it in some of the banks, that they get overwhelmed. The people who are left, the back office staff, get overwhelmed, so they become disillusioned. That then affects the front office staff. They get overwhelmed, they become disillusioned, and that rubs off onto the customers. So we have to look at it, but try not to run the same race twice. To me, the strategic positioning is to run a different race, to look at a different way of doing things, to differentiate yourself. And if I use the Avis car rental example again, Warren Avis was an airline pilot in the 50s, and he happened to notice that a lot of the customers for the airline were doing short-haul, one-day trips. And when he looked into it, he worked out that it was salesmen. They were flying to a city, hiring a car and going and seeing all their customers and flying back the next day. And then he realised that the Hertz rental cars were in the city. So the salesman had to get from the airport to the city to hire the car to go and see the customers. So he came up with, well, wouldn't it make sense to put the car hire at the airport? And that's what he did. So he was looking at it from a different way. He wasn't looking at running the same race. He was looking at a different way of doing things. Only a marginal difference, but that little 1% makes one hell of a big difference at the end of it. So we should always try and run a different race. Now, I'm conscious I've got round about to the end of my time, and I hope you found it of interest, and I hope it stimulated some thought for you and give you some pointers. But one of the last thoughts I'd like to leave you with is, to me, that if you don't get this right, it's not your good customers that will stay, and nor is it your poor staff that will leave. So I hope you found that of use, and I wish you all the best in your businesses and going forward on it. and I'll hand you over to John. Thank you.
Thank you.